while we all get our electronics set, just want to talk a little bit about our objective for this panel, which is bridging the gap between the macro context that Amy presented and how it's relevant and potentially applicable to the greater Washington region. To do that, as Amy mentioned, we have places, city regions, that have been through the mess and that have been working on these issues of global economic connections and competitiveness and are starting to produce results. We also actually have in the room several representatives from metropolitan areas across the United States and internationally who have been here for the past few days working with us on these questions of problem solving, different approaches, best practices, additional research is required to make them more effective. That included Los Angeles, London, UK, Louisville, Portland. So they may want to contribute some thoughts as we go through the panel discussion. All these places have been through a very specific approach that was piloted and now has been replicated in communities across the country and increasingly international. And that involved market assessments, data-driven approaches to identify where the strengths were. An export strategy planning process was always the entry point, although it's evolved in San Diego's case. Atlanta's moving through this now into integrating more comprehensively foreign direct investment activities with exports, but also workforce issues, infrastructure issues, as she mentioned. And then operational commitments by not just the individual organizations that might be quarterbacking these efforts, but all the participants at the county level, at the city level, making specific commitments to implementation, resources in kind or in some cases financial, the business community, and then performance measures. So how are they actually demonstrating progress incrementally through outputs and then ultimately outcomes and long-term shifts in economic activity. So that's the context that we are trying to present to you. And we have three presidents and CEOs here. Hela Monomog from the Metropolitan Atlanta Chamber of Commerce, a private sector-led group, economic development activities across a 20-plus county region. Also a heavy services economy, which is why we try to align some of the characteristics of Greater Washington with the representatives here. A heavy services economy, a fantastic international infrastructure connectivity through the airport, so leveraging some of those assets. Jan De Silva, who's the president and CEO of the Greater Toronto Board of Trade. And Toronto actually was not originally part of our formal exchange, but identified this as an issue, identified the work that was being done, and then followed the template and adapted it to Toronto. It's now been brought into our network. So they independently determined this was important to Toronto. And again, a services-oriented economy, international connectivity, fourth largest metropolitan area in the continent. And then Mark Cafferty from San Diego, who you heard about as well. San Diego struggling with some of the global identity and projection issues that Amy mentioned has been important to this region, but also innovation economy, binational issues on how to deal with multiple jurisdictions working together. So this is our panel, and I just want to start with Hela. Atlanta, what was the motivation behind deciding to pursue this? Atlanta's economy is strong, Fortune 500 companies. Why did you decide to focus on this, particularly when Atlanta's emphasis previously had been so heavy on business relocation and attraction?
Well, first of all, before I begin my comments, and you'll see I have brought lots of notes because my team has done all the work on this, and so I want to do a shout out to them before. But before I answer that question, I just want to say after hearing Amy's remarks, I'm deeply grateful that we are engaged, because it's really pretty scary when you think about it. So thank you to Brookings and to my team and everybody that we work with on this. What happened to us in Atlanta is that we discovered pretty quickly into this process that we were very much an under-exporting kind of city. And we mirror a lot of things up there, so I'll just kind of rattle these things off. But we're the ninth largest economy, ninth largest group according to population. We're the 10th largest economy in the U.S., 14th in exports, but the problem became very apparent to us when we discovered that we were 64th 64 out of 100 in terms of export intensity. So we knew that as a percentage of our economic output, our exports were not keeping up. So that really got our attention, thanks to you guys. And so we said, look, we now know we have this gap in our exports, and we really need to do something about it. And further to your point about a market that was heavily invested in recruiting companies, and we, frankly still are, because it's, Atlanta is still a very attractive place to move. You have the airport. It is, we're named once again the best state to do business in by the Site Selection magazine for the third year in a row. So we can still enjoy that piece of the puzzle, but we know from our strategic work and then obviously from your data is that is not a sustainable model. And it's not really that great for the U.S. because we're just moving people around. So we've been working on other ways to expand and grow the companies that work with us. So when we also suffered disproportionately during the recession, the 2008 recession. And I believe the reason we did basically is because we were heavily dependent upon real estate. That was one of our issues. And then we were also, luckily, we have an enormously diverse economy, 18 Fortune 500s, et cetera. But a lot of them were heavily consumer dependent. So when the consumer stopped spending, so although we're growing gangbusters now, the jobs are coming back, we're in a net positive, we really realized during that downturn that we had to do something different. So this Global Cities Initiative was perfect for us. And we also learned from you and others that $1 billion in export can create over 5,000 jobs. And the other thing that was interesting about us is, to your point about services, very similar to the greater Washington area. Approximately 50% of our exports are services, and some of the people who are exporters of services don't even really understand that they are exporters of services. And so we weren't really having that as part of the conversation. And so we've really kind of tried to turn that on its head and make sure people understand how important that is. So, I will stop there, but that just kind of laid the groundwork. It's the thing that made us say, wow, we have to get involved, we have to get busy, and we have to view things differently.
So Jan, similar question to you. What motivated you, particularly because we didn't come to you and say, hey, are you interested in this issue? You identified this on your own. What was the motivation for Greater Toronto and for the business community to take this issue on?
Sure, happy to do it. Very similar to Atlanta, the recession had a big impact on our economy. But let me just cycle back for a second and put Toronto in the context of the Canadian economy. Toronto represents 20% of the country's GDP. So if things don't work in Toronto, things create problems across the country as well. 40% of our corporate headquarters are located in Toronto region. We got a lot of kudos during the financial crisis for the strength of our banking system, but the unintended impact of the crisis was that our export market imploded. Where we were doing about $168 billion of trade pre-crisis, that dropped to about $165 billion. A big part of that was because of the slowdown in consumer markets in the U.S. We were overly dependent on our most important trade partner, and we hadn't been able to rebalance the markets of access. So that was a real critical issue for us in terms of how do we figure out how to get access to these other high growth markets that have tremendous resonance for the strength of our industry clusters in Toronto. So that really is what it was about. It was just trying to get that diversity of economy and helping our members get access to markets that they previously hadn't thought of.
Did you get any pushback from local leadership saying, why is this important? Or issues around organizing the effort?
Well, Toronto has had some interesting mayors. I know that people are aware of our previous mayor. Our current mayor, and let me say our mayors throughout the region, we've got a really, probably the best in history, the best bench strength that we've ever had at the mayor's office across the region. They are working extremely collaboratively together. They've got very smart visions about the strength in numbers. We're working very closely with them. We're putting together a regional agency because I think the cities quickly recognize that by trying to do things onesies and twosies, if they consolidate budget, consolidate effort, they can have a much bigger impact.
So you do not currently have a regional economic development organization?
As of January 1st, we will.
And could you just get a little description there about, you have a number of very significant cities. It's not just about the city of Toronto. Could you just describe that? Because I think it resembles this region in some ways.
Yeah, if we look at Toronto region, Toronto really is the core, but we've got cities like Mississauga and Brampton, which are the second and third largest in those markets. So we've got roughly about 1 million people in Brampton, another 600,000, sorry, 1 million people in Mississauga, 600,000 in Brampton. The other thing that's quite interesting for our economy, we've got a heavy newcomer component. Over the next decade, another 1.2 million people will be moving into our region, which also has implications around opportunity for export and job creation requirements.
So Mark, for San Diego, you entered through exports. You've had some mayoral fun too.
I was thinking the only reason
talk about that.
The only reason that people in the room probably don't know more about our mayor is because of your mayor,
Our
past mayor. Our current mayor is fantastic, but I'm also thinking as Georgia sits on stage and says how they've been voted the #1 state to do business in for the past 3 years. California hasn't quite measured up on those lists. But the reality for us in San Diego, I think, is really similar. We did, our engagement with Brookings and JPMorgan Chase was at a point in time where locally we were trying to figure out how is San Diego's economy going to grow in this incredible economy of California. You can say what you want about the state of California. It is still a remarkable economy. It is still a huge economy, but in many ways, the second largest city in the state of California, 8th largest city in the country, is often completely overlooked. When people start to think about sort of what are the economies that power California, what are the metropolitan economies that are really kind of teaching and connecting to the rest of the globe, we had a very local economy. We had a very military-centric economy. We still have a very military-centric economy, but we started analyzing it very closely at the local level to figure out what are our economic engines and what are our economic drivers. Many people may not remember that San Diego was once an aerospace hub. And the aerospace industry melted down in the 80s and 90s in San Diego, and tens of thousands of jobs left the region. So the region has had to think for a long time about how to build a very diverse innovation economy so that those engineers that lost those jobs could go into and then help grow our biotech sector, our telecommunications sector, our emerging health IT sector, and also start to kind of take the innovation that was coming out of the military and spin it into the private sector. So I'd argue that while we don't have the biggest innovation economy in the United States, we probably have the most diverse innovation economy in the United States, and that's been on purpose. But what we realized right around the time we were seeing and noticing the work that you all were doing was where San Diego was completely underperforming, with the exact same way that was described for Atlanta, is 8th largest city in the country, 12th to 20th largest metropolitan economy in a whole host of different measures, 40th, 60th, 70th when it comes to export intensity, foreign direct investment. And then you look at Amy's numbers on where the economic growth in the world is going to be in the years ahead, and we weren't in that game at all. And I think 3 years later, we very much feel like we are in that game, continuing to learn from so many folks in the room that have an awful lot to offer on what we've picked up along the way.
But you're on a border. Doesn't that make you global?
Well, it's interesting. The border has become, Mexico is probably one of the biggest economic assets San Diego has, and it was completely undermarketed and underutilized on an international stage. So R&D can be done in any number of sectors in San Diego, probably as well with as talented a workforce as you'll find anywhere in the country. And then a few miles down the road, you can actually bring products to fruition by manufacturing them in northern Baja. Now, many people across the country right now think of the border and they think of walls and fences and security. If our Chamber of Commerce was sitting on the stage with me today, if our mayor of San Diego was sitting on the stage with me today, they would all lead with how important it is for us to modernize that border, increase the flow of commerce across the border, and we truly are a bicultural, binational region, and it's the biggest economic asset we had, and for years we were completely overlooking it.
So I want to make sure that everyone knows this is a strategic planning process, but there's actually activity that comes out of a strategic planning process and not just a plan that you hand out and say, hey, we're going to do this. So Hella, could you describe, you officially launched to finalize the process in the spring, but could you describe some of the activities or the different approaches that you're taking as a region toward the issue of increasing exports and global engagement?
Well, I mean, really, it's it's pretty simple to say, not necessarily easy to do. But basically, we just from the very beginning knew that we needed to assemble a broad team, and we knew it needed to be our government officials. We knew it needed to be our partners in the various large counties around the Atlanta metro area. We've got Nick Messino from Gwinnett County here. He was one of the first to raise his hand and say, I want to be involved.
Is that unusual?
Yeah, for Nick, it's unusual. No, I'm teasing. No. And actually, I kind of did that on purpose, and I can say that on purpose because, just like a lot of regions that are very complex, and when you start talking about recruiting companies coming in or moving them around the region, it is competitive by nature. And it's also kind of silly because we're not really growing that whole pie. So I think, although we love our partners in the counties, and we had already started to work really closely with them and try to really increase the level of relationship and trust, I would definitely say that this Global Cities Initiative helped that enormously because, I don't want to sound naive, but from a standpoint of exports, that is not competitive. I mean, that's going to help everybody, if you're pushing your companies out that way. So it really was an opportunity for us not only to do something tangible together, but we also, being who we are, the Chamber of Commerce, and Nick is with the Chamber in Cobb County, the private sector was enormously helpful here and had to be a big part of it. So our chairs of our launch were Dave Meeks from UPS. UPS is headquartered in Atlanta, and then also David Bates. So we from JPMorgan Chase. So we had the private sector there with us, but we worked at getting these partners involved. And I'd say the biggest outcome really is that people started talking frequently about exports, and it just hadn't been a big conversation, in our region. So, it's always about, collaboration, which everybody, again, overused word. But if you've got tangible things to try to secure, and if you've got really great data telling you, wow, if you don't get engaged, you're gonna miss the boat, kind of gets people's attention. So it's actually been a fun process for us.
So one of the sectors that this region talks about as an opportunity is sort of in the tech area, because it gets services,
Right.
less production
Right.
of goods, and linking up with maybe business growth or business accelerator activities. I know you all have as one of those activities under the export effort and increasingly the foreign direct investment activity, the example of tech industries, and particularly linking up with Tel Aviv and Israel. Could you describe a little bit about that?
Yeah, exactly, and that's really it's a very great example, and thank you for asking. Two of the big areas that we do have intensity in Atlanta. One is fintech, and the other is cybersecurity. So I'll have to let Peter know that I've got a 70% number too, and my 70% number is that 70% of all of the payments in the U.S., credit, debit, and gift cards, goes through the Atlanta metro region, and we're very proud of that. So that's a dense area. And cybersecurity, 25% of the world's cybersecurity goes through Atlanta. So those are two areas that we knew we wanted to make sure we were opening our doors to. So there's something called the Atlanta Gateway Initiative, Atlanta Tech Gateway Initiative. And so really this is something that we've set up with other partners in the region to make sure that we are reaching out to those technology companies around the globe that may be trying to enter the Atlanta market, or trying to enter the U.S. market, and we obviously want them to come to Atlanta, and basically providing them the tools that they need and giving them a kind of a soft landing here. We refer to it sort of as our Ellis Island, that come here, we will help you, we will, get you introduced to the right people and get you started. So those two areas are the first ones we're working on, Israel and India, and fintech and cybersecurity. And again, we're very proud to have that, and we think it's going to pay great dividends.
So Jan, in Toronto, when you went through your market assessment, what were some of the interesting findings from that, and then what were the particular actions that you took that you had not been engaged with before?
Okay, the interesting thing about Toronto is at all levels of government, the federal, provincial, and municipal, regional government had identified the need to export more as a big priority. And they had wonderful support programs in place. The problem was they just weren't engaging the business community. So what we did through GCI is we did an export strategy assessment of our business community to find out for those companies that were exporting, why weren't they exporting more? And for those that weren't, why not? And nothing was earth-shattering. A lot of it had to do with they just didn't have mind space to be able to take a look at other markets. They didn't have expertise within the firm. They weren't sure where to go. So despite the best efforts of our governments to provide all these tremendous support programs, there just wasn't enough awareness. So what we did is we launched something called TAP GTA. TAP stands for Trade Accelerator Program. We're working with all levels of government. We've actually got our pilot group of companies in place right now. And how we solved for activating the business community is we've got 3 of our largest corporations in Toronto region involved as sponsors. So it's UPS, it's Royal Bank of Canada, and it's CN. And they're nominating their clients who are exporting now, who have the potential to export more, or companies that are their clients that they feel have the potential to become export ready, into a 90-day program that's helping them identify what it would take for their organization to get into export, help them with market entry strategies. And then, like Greater Washington, Toronto has a lot of the international consulates here. Our ambassadors are up in Ottawa, but in Toronto, all the major markets have consul generals. They're on our advisory board. And as companies come through the accelerator and say, UK is where I want to go, we're connecting them with the UK Consul General who's creating some connections into that market. So for us, it was all about the solve for was how do you activate, how do you engage business to actually get involved, and that's what we've got underway. So over the next 3 years, we're hoping to have 1,200 companies go through this, about 100 a quarter. We're hoping to generate about $500 million of new export business. Not a huge number, but it starts to create a culture and awareness in the business community that others are doing this.
So it's, and that's actually, I think, a very consistent outcome from this. It's not that complicated. Once you go through the process, you identify where the opportunities hook is, and then you just coordinate existing assets, because you found that the provision of services was good as long as the companies were proactively reached, and then it could be engaged if you're coordinated more effectively in mainstream economic development activities. Is that fair to say?
That's right. Yeah, and I know Mayor Daley's here. We're a baseball town and a hockey town. Baseball a little bit better than hockey, but we were also quite competitive in terms of Chicago, and we kept talking about the fact Chicago and the state of Illinois, very similar profile to Toronto and the province of Ontario. And over the last decade, and I think this is, again, a big credit to what the mayor had done, a decade ago, Toronto was out trading, or Ontario was out trading Illinois and China. We were doing about $1.2 billion of trade. State of Illinois was doing $900 million. Fast forward a decade, we've gone from 1.2 to 2.2 billion, kind of okay. Illinois went from 900 million to 5.7 billion. And 3 of their top 5 trade sectors with China we're stronger in. So we're hoping to take on Chicago in that regard. But that was a really good kind of a scorecard for us to say to the business community, you know, we're missing opportunities.
So Mark, I'm going to hit you with 3 points that you might integrate, and then go to some questions. Number one, another example, I think life sciences, just to diversify, because life sciences is another growing sector around here. Life sciences might be helpful in understanding what you all are doing and how you work with your sectoral associations and how you identify that, and maybe a little on what you're pursuing on place to place, and one of the creative strategies on metro to metro trading or economic collaborations, and also because of this kind of identity issue in Greater Washington, maybe talk a little bit about how San Diego's grappling with that. And the final point is just kind of weave in there because of the presence of universities and how significant the universities were as anchors for you in the whole process. So good luck with that.
So thank you. The interesting thing is when we would go overseas and we would listen a bit, San Diego, there were certainly folks from San Diego who were traveling overseas to take sort of traditional trade missions. We weren't seeing a lot, coming back. You sort of say to those folks, what did we get from the trips to China? Well, we told China a little bit about San Diego. We brought a great video. We met with this person. We met with that person. You didn't look around and see investment coming back to San Diego in the way that you were seeing in other regions. So one of the things when we, the EDC, and it's probably important to note, the San Diego Regional EDC is a county-wide entity, and it's private sector funded. So unlike a lot of economic development corporations, we're not city funded, we're not county funded, we're not funded really by any of the municipalities, although we have partnerships with all of them. We work very, very closely with all of them. We stay out of politics. We don't endorse candidates. We don't take on positions on bills. It allows us to actually be an economic development arm to our county, to our city, and in many ways to key leadership in the state of California. And I think it's important to note, and I'll kind of circle back around to it in a second, but when we would travel overseas, we would hear when we listened that other regions that were doing this work well were leading with their universities. We have great universities in San Diego. We weren't coordinating with them. We certainly were not leading with them. You know, and if I throw a stat out to most folks that would be mind-blowing, the University of California, San Diego has more engineering students right now than Stanford and Berkeley together. And you can fact check that, that's actually right. But you wouldn't think that internationally when you go out and you see the persona that Stanford and Berkeley have versus what UC San Diego has. So we knew that that was part of the identity problem that we needed to change, but we also knew we had to bring real tangible, San Diego's an interesting city. If we don't bring results back, then people are gonna say, the trade talk sounds great, the foreign direct investment talk sounds great, what have we seen from it? So we really started focusing in on data that showed us what regions we had the greatest connectedness to. And what we were realizing was Japan was investing a lot and connecting a lot with our biotech industry in San Diego. We have one of the 2 or 3 largest biotech sectors in the country by any standard, but when it comes to the genomic sciences, really the future of biotechnology, San Diego is #1 by far. And there was a lot of investment happening from Japan to San Diego. And so when we went to Japan, what we would see is there was very positive thoughts of San Diego's economy in Japan, and we began to realize that we could actually spin out a little bit further from just biotechnology and start to introduce new sectors of our economy to then. We've seen tremendous investment in San Diego from Japan and a real cultural connectedness that we've worked very hard on over the last few years, and that's been a part of this process. I think, in San Diego is a county that is about the size of the state of Connecticut, large geographic area, with about 3.4 million people. Collaboration was mentioned a few times, and I can't emphasize enough that that's not just a nice term for us in San Diego. That is a way that we have to operate to compete with a lot of you. And our mayor knows that. He looks at sort of historically the Richard Daley, Tom Menino, Mike Bloomberg model of mayors going out and really leading economic dialogue and really kind of bringing influence and connectedness back to the region. We have a Republican mayor in San Diego who's trying to do that right now, trying to take a page out of those playbooks, which is a pretty interesting thing in a large U.S. city to have a Republican mayor. Not strange at all for him to be business focused, but to really look at who are the top metros in the U.S. via the connectedness that we have to the Global Cities Initiative, and how do we begin to kind of focus on what they've been able to do in their regions and the identity that they've created overseas. But we also have to do that with a lot of key industry cluster groups and trade associations. As our biotechnology industry grew, a group called Biocom grew with it, stride by stride. To try to do anything with that sector and not be operating through Biocom is just really not a good plan in San Diego. Before any of us were talking about incubators or accelerators, an organization called Connect was spinning out of the University of California, San Diego, and starting to take the brilliant minds in academia and connecting them to the people who actually knew how to start businesses and make them grow. And they've been doing it for 30 plus years. So for us to do this work well, we had to collaborate with those groups. We had to stop being competitive with them. And we had key leadership in San Diego, business leadership, say to us, carve out your running lanes to do this right, or just merge. Just all come together and merge, because we're tired of putting money into all of these different groups and then trying to figure out what they do differently from each other. Now we get seen as the group that really is marketing San Diego as a business destination to the globe to attract more investment into San Diego, to attract more talent into our region. And we do it oftentimes by marketing those very organizations that I just spoke about as the key drivers in our region to doing business there.
Just back to the universities for just one quick second. What role did the universities play in case Greater Washington decides, oh, this is a good idea, let's do it? What role did the universities specifically play in the creation of the plan and then sort of in the execution now?
So the University of California, San Diego actually did the environmental scan for us. So when we first sat down to do it, we've got great research universities in San Diego. A gentleman named Peter Cowie, who leads an international institute within UC San Diego, who's done a lot of export-related work here in Washington with the administration. So he was a perfect person to lead that effort. But we also knew that if we got too centric to one university, the largest economic driver that we have in San Diego from a workforce development perspective is actually San Diego State University. it puts more people out into the local economy to work. So we knew if we got too connected to one university, we weren't inclusive of all of them, we weren't going to have that buy-in moving forward, and we were going to miss out on key workforce development strategies that would support the economic development strategy. So every one of those university presidents is now on our board, every university in San Diego. We've brought 3 of the community college presidents in on our board as well. So when our private sector leadership sits down every month, and 50 plus of them come into a room every month to talk about these issues, all of the university presidents are right there with them. And when we develop strategies to execute through committees, they're all around the table as well. So not only did they do the scan for us initially, but since then, they have traveled with us globally. They've been key partners funding efforts in San Diego to make sure that we can continue to do this. And I would say in a lot of ways these days, if you were to sit down on any initiative that we have in San Diego, not only would you hear JPMorgan Chase and Brookings' name in virtually every discussion we're having, but we would be flanked by the universities as sort of the key economic partners.
Is that a similar experience in Toronto and in Atlanta, in Toronto?
Oh, absolutely. We've got a very, very inclusive board. The other thread I just wanted to pull on this, and again, it's going back to the international community. We've also been very, very actively reaching out to, say, Canada-China Business Council, Canada-India Council, making sure they're at the table, and it's not competing with them. It's all about supporting them because they can support us as we're looking at going global. And the final point, just on the Consul Generals, what was remarkable for us when we were inviting them on to our TAP advisory board, we were trying to sell them on what we were trying to do, and what was amazing was that each country had a very clear view of what the business sectors were in Toronto that should be doing business in their market. So we're now working with Google to try to create some kind of search database so that as companies are going through the accelerator, they can plug through there and figure out. But there's a lot you can learn just by talking to these other markets around who they think is a good fit and what are the issues in their markets that we should be plugging into.
Yeah, just same thing absolutely with the Consul Generals, and we have way more than I think people would expect in Atlanta. It's one of the obviously being gigantic in the Southeast, but we work very closely with them, and it's to your point, they have a very clear vision already of what needs to be done for their country. So we'd be silly not to work with them and hear what they have to say. Same thing on the universities. We're very fortunate to have Georgia Tech right there with us. We've got Georgia State, University of Georgia. We have the historically black universities, 2 of the best in the country, Spelman and Morehouse. They're all right there with us and very interested in this. And I have to give a stat on Georgia Tech. We graduate also more engineers than Berkeley and Stanford combined. We use that one. And we also graduate more female engineers than anybody in the Milky Way galaxy, and more African American engineers than anybody else. So we've got a very strong, innovative group there. And one more thing about Georgia Tech, on that campus, there are now 12 innovation centers of companies from all around the globe who have decided to, put themselves there to work with the university. So it all works. It's everybody together, and it works beautifully when it comes together.
I think you all have just thrown down the gauntlet of the Bay Area because they're not part of the Global Cities Initiative.
They don't think they have to.
Well, I think the gauntlet was just thrown down to the whole galaxy right there.
Yeah.
That is pretty impressive. So
I'm going to look around the room. I have more personal questions, but I'm going to look around the room and see if there's anyone who has a question, and we'll bring a microphone over. Here's one right here. Microphone. Here's the question. Or why don't you can offer the question. Thanks, Mariella.
You want to come? Yeah. My name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation. I think the trade is very important. But I just wonder first, how do you balance the government priorities, especially if you use a lot of officials, such like cities, mayors, county executive, and governor, and everything. They bring the staff overseas rather than private competition. Second is we have a problem domestically. So how do you balance those? How to fight a crime? How to balance the homelessness? How do you redirect the financial and budget?
Okay, thank you.
Anyone want to take the question about how do you balance the multiple jurisdictions? Maybe it's a bit about, is this all data-driven? At least that piece of it, and then...
Sure.
Yeah, well, I'll be happy to jump on that because Atlanta is very, shall I say, chopped up we have a very small city of Atlanta, relatively speaking. We're about close to 6 million in our metro, but only about 400,000 in the city. And then we do have 29 counties. But when we go on trade missions, if I understood your question correctly, the mayor and the governor or whomever is going always invites the private sector. So when we go on these trips, we go with them, and frankly, we end up doing a lot of sort of protocol type things, but we make sure that when we're there, we are getting business done and having any and all side meetings that we need to do to make that happen. And I also just want to respond to your second question about sort of the inequality in some of our major metro areas, and Atlanta certainly has that issue. And so when we talk now about all the wonderful things that are happening, all the jobs we're creating, and all these wonderful things that we've all talked about, we also go ahead and say, but we actually have a big disparity issue in our region, and all these things that we're working on won't really make the difference that they could and should unless we acknowledge that and work on that at the same time. So we're hoping that some of these things we do and some of these jobs we bring, we've already heard they're higher paying, et cetera, will help to raise the whole region.
Any other quick, there's one more question over there, so I just want to put any other quick comments, responses to that?
I would just say quickly, the social issue is important to the business community. And if you look at root cause and how do you solve for it, a lot of stuff that we're doing through our trade program, our mayor unabashedly says strong business means strong philanthropic contributions, and strong export business means we get the transit and infrastructure built to move goods, which also helps people from lower income neighborhoods easily get access to jobs. So there's a lot that's wholly interrelated in terms of export and business growth being really, really important to solve for what is very high profile in our community about trying to deal with income disparity and how do you solve for that around getting people access to jobs. We've got a problem right now with transit infrastructure. Our lower income families tend to live outside the core because they can't afford to live in the core, yet some of them are spending 3 hours on buses trying to get into jobs, and that's not good for family, it's not good for them. So as I said, everything's interrelated and you've got to solve for it, but at the end of the day you need a strong financial model that enables all of that to happen, which is why the focus is on business growth and export as an enabler.
And so on the two sides of that, so very similar on the international connectedness, our trade missions are driven by the private sector. So it's really set up by the private sector and then inviting in key elected officials to really show that public-private partnership. So while our governor is doing some work statewide at the local level when we're out representing San Diego, it's very much a private sector driven delegation. And then we bring in the key elected officials to kind of help with the message. At the local level, one very tangible thing is our mayor has gotten very involved in this economic development plan, thinking of economic development this way. The two things that people will always say when they visit San Diego is a beautiful place. It's absolutely a beautiful place. The second thing they'll say to me is, I had no idea you had such a homeless problem. And so when you come there and you hear about all these things that we're talking about, you're struck by the homelessness in downtown San Diego. Our mayor is recognizing now that to be one of these global cities, we just can't talk about great academic universities and economic growth. It has to touch all corners of our community. So he created a task force that I got to co-chair with the chancellor of our community colleges, the head of UCSD, and about 15 community leaders to bring recommendations back to him on how San Diego's economic growth could begin to get connected to the more disadvantaged neighborhoods in San Diego, and how in more of a grassroots community development way we could start to get the economic development strategy to touch all corners of the city of San Diego and the county for that matter.
Question right here. Elizabeth? And what's my chime check? 5 minutes? 5 minutes. 5 minutes, thanks.
All of you talked about the sometimes surprisingly leading role of universities. And I wonder whether you can recount some of your experience of how to get universities to open up their research and companies, and particularly startups, to start connecting with universities.
I would lead with a very quick example and be very happy to connect you, no pun intended, to them, but connect. The group that I mentioned in San Diego, it started with the university. It started with the acknowledgement that there was brilliant ideas there, but they weren't spinning out and creating jobs and creating businesses. So for 30 plus years they've been doing just that. And famously, Irwin Jacobs, the founder of Qualcomm, was one of the individuals who created Connect. And Mary Walshack, who's one of the best sort of academic thinkers in the workforce and economic development arena, was one of the people who created Connect. And it kind of changes and adapts every few years, depending on what's happening in academia and the economy. But they would be a great example of someone who has spun out hundreds of businesses and thousands of jobs, all from academic research. And other universities in San Diego have then kind of connected and tagged onto that. It has fully spun out of the university, so it's its own standalone organization, but has very strong ties into all of our academic institutions.
Other comments? Georgia Tech is a great example.
Yeah, I would say on that, all of the presidents of the large universities in our region sit also on our board, and they are very engaged. They are there. They want to be with the business community, and the business community wants to be with them. So we have their full attention and their full help with moving things forward. The other thing that I didn't mention about Georgia Tech before is there is a group called ATDC, which is, it's been around for over 30 years, kind of like what was mentioned there. And I think it's rated as the 12th greatest incubator in the United States. And the point there is that the business community with the startups sometimes help bring them in. The Georgia Tech professors and leaders there get them educated. And then the part that we can actually bring to it through the chamber is then making those connections for them to the very large companies. Again, we 29 Fortune 1000 companies in our area and very diverse. So it really works well. So there's just such a mutual goal with our universities that there's just never been a pushback, really. I mean, it's something that they're very much into, and many times they go on these economic development trips because they already have a presence in a city, or they want to set one up. And education is one of our main exports from the Atlanta region.
And actually just to add, what we found in other markets is also that the universities have had to change their policies around intellectual property, around what percentages they keep, right? So there are lots of factors in there, but there's this focus on traded sectors and this focus on more global orientation has helped kind of motivate some of those, not a complete success, but some of those additional activities. I'll take
Yeah,
last question.
Merrick.
The last question.
Since I'm holding the mic, I'll tell you. I'm wondering how you view the federal government as a partner for foreign direct investment attraction and retention, and what would be one thing the federal government could do with regard to promotion, and one thing federal government could do in terms of policy? Thank you.
Do you even care about the federal government? I'm not sorry, Aaron, but that's and then.
Okay, if I can speak to it in the context of Canada, where our federal government has been highly effective is in negotiating trade agreements. That's critically important to give us equal market access. So I would say that's where we really want our federal government to be playing.
Yeah, I'll add too. We just recently were able to host in Atlanta the final negotiation for TPP. And so we were very proud to have it there. So from that context, and we hope TTIP goes through. So from that context, excellent. I guess from any other context, it really goes back to something I think that Peter had alluded to. This whole business of major cities and areas. The one that we're in is PAM, the Piedmont Atlantic mega city region area of the country. And I just think that's where the power is going, and that's where the strength will come, and that's how we'll really create jobs and get to some of this, lessening of disparities is when those regions really work together. So it's not that I don't care about the federal government, but our focus is on let's move this gigantic region because we can be very, very strong.
Mark, final point.
We're so heavily funded by the federal government. When you think of military and you think of academic research, we have so much money that we do care a great deal about the federal government. On the trade side, I agree 100%. I mean, our business community, our community rallied behind TPP, TPA, that legislation we believe will be critical and game-changing to San Diego. But it's also, right, it's the message coming from Washington. So one of the two of you mentioned that there was a lot of people talking about exports. So when you factor it down to the local level, when the president's talking about exports, when folks like Brookings are advising him to do that, when the governor of California wants to increase exports, then at the local level for us, our dialogue fits in with that dialogue, and there's some synergy there. So I think the message out of Washington has been a critical one for us locally as well.
Okay. And I'll just speak from personal experience. I moved back to Toronto in January this year after 15 years in Asia. I think the other important thing that federal governments can do is the tone of their relationship with these other markets. Some of the emerging markets don't separate business from government. And so if your government's narrative and your government's engagement with these markets is not progressive and positive, your companies in those markets get put in the penalty box. And so that would be the other thing that I think is really important from a tone and message and engagement with these markets at the top level.
Terrific. Thank you all very much for trekking to Washington to share. And now we'll lead to our next panel.